Well, hi everyone. Shalom. This is Rabbi Andrew from Rosh Hashanah Messianic Congregation. Welcome to our weekly Torah study here this Wednesday. Rosh Hashanah is a Messianic congregation in the downtown Toronto area, and we are a fellowship of Jewish and non-Jewish people who come together to worship the God of Israel in spirit and in truth. And we also teach the entire Word of God fully centered on the Jewish Messiah, Yeshua. So welcome. Glad that you could join us. I see some of you signing on. Shalom to you. We're going to begin. This week, we're looking at part of the weekly Torah portion, which this week's Torah portion is called Pinchas, after the first part of the Torah portion, which deals with Pinchas, or in English he's called Phineas, but he was one of the Cohens, one of the priests, and so it's named after him. But we're going to be looking at basically chapters 28 and 29, and this is actually going to be a short teaching today. So we're not going to cover the entire chapter 28 and 29, but we're just going to talk about a brief introduction to it. So this week, what we look at in chapter 28 and 29, which is the last part of the weekly Torah portion, it deals with the Moedim, or the appointed times of Adonai. And this was already covered in various places, especially in Leviticus chapter 23. It was the first time that we saw God's calendar being laid out for us, that the Lord explained these were his appointed times. And it deals with basically the way that God looks at time, and the way that Israel was also supposed to meet with God at certain appointed times throughout the year. So that's really what Leviticus 23 talked about. Now here in Numbers chapter 28 and 29, it deals with something that in Judaism is called Musaf. And what that means, Musaf, so M-U-S-A-F if you want to spell it in English, but basically what it means is the additional offerings. Additional offerings, in other words, they are additional to the regular offerings that were made daily. See, there were to be daily offerings made in the tabernacle and later in the temple, and we're going to talk about that today. So first, before we go and look at the extra offerings, we're going to look at first the regular ones and how that then translates into the Jewish prayer services, daily prayer service, then how that might have also implications for all of us also as believers. So Numbers chapter 28 verse 1 says, Adonai spoke to Moses saying, command Bnei Israel and tell them to be careful to present to me at the Moedim my food offerings as by fire as a pleasing aroma. And so what this is going to be talking about in Numbers 28 and 29, the emphasis is the special offerings that are to be brought at the appointed times. And so then he goes on to say that they were to prepare one lamb in the morning and another lamb you are to prepare at twilight. So there were daily regular offerings, which are called tamid in Hebrew. Tamid sometimes can mean perpetual, but in this context, it means regular, like daily. These are the daily offerings that go on. And they were to be in the morning and in the evening. And the additional offerings then would be on every Shabbat, every new moon, and then the 7 appointed times throughout the year, Passover and Feast of Weeks, Yom Teruah or Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot, etc. So the way that it would work would be every day there were special offerings that were given. And then if it was Shabbat, the weekly Shabbat day service, there would be the normal daily offering, and then an additional offering because it is Shabbat, it's a special holy day. Okay? Now, imagine if it happened that it was Shabbat, but it also happened that was also Passover, because that could happen. So then in that case, what would happen? It would be cumulative. There would be the daily regular sacrifice, because that doesn't stop. And then the next would be the Shabbat extra offering or sacrifice. And then because it's Passover, there's another one for Passover. So you wouldn't negate one and just say, oh, well, we're doing this one, so we won't do that one. See, so it would be cumulative. So they would have extra offerings, okay? That's how it would work. And if you read through Numbers 28 and 29, that's what it's explaining. Now, in Numbers 28 and 29, by the way, there's no mention of the tabernacle. And what that allows for, and allowed for later in biblical Judaism, was that, initially these sacrifices were made in the tabernacle in the wilderness, and then later the tabernacle was set up in Israel at a couple of places. One was Shiloh, where it was for more than 360 years it was there. And so that was where these offerings and sacrifices were made, at the tent of meeting at the tabernacle. But because it's not even mentioned here in Numbers 28 and 29, that allowed for the possibility, and then later the reality, that these offerings would be made in the temple. So you see, God didn't say they must only be in the tabernacle, but they could be in the temple. Now, it is believed that actually in the first temple, the Temple of Solomon, that the tabernacle was there in the temple, and the Ark of the Covenant was there. We know that for a fact from reading the Bible. The Ark of the Covenant was there. But in the second temple, it wasn't there. But because those items are not mentioned here in Numbers chapter 20 and 29, they were still able to do these daily sacrifices, and also the special Shabbat weekly and the monthly and so on. And so, first of all, we look at the way God looks at time. Okay, he looks at a day a certain way. There was to be a morning and an evening sacrifice. Then there was supposed to be a weekly special day of worship called Shabbat. And also the first of every month was to be recognized as a holy day and had its own special offerings. And it makes sense because, I think all people believe that it's good to, start your day with prayer. Like that would be ideal, right? Or maybe even start your week off, but how about the month? How about starting the month in worshiping God and so on? So these are extra times of worship. Now, one thing that's interesting is a biblical month was always 30 days. It's based on the lunar cycle. That's the biblical month, 30 days. And when you look at the fact that there were how many new moons? 12, right? 12 new moons. And then, so there were special extra worship times, extra sacrifices, extra offerings every new moon. So that's 12. And then if you look at the other appointed times during the year, other than the weekly Shabbat, you have 7 days of Passover. And then you have Shavuot, that makes 8. Then you have Yom Teruah or Rosh Hashanah, that makes 9. Yom Kippur makes 10. Sukkot makes another 7, so that's 7. And then there's an extra 8th day at the end of Sukkot. So you have 18 there. Okay, 18 special sacrifices throughout the year in addition to the regular ones, plus the 12 months. So 12 and 18 equals 30. So there's another 30. It's almost like there's a whole month, throughout the year in that sense. So I just want to look at a few examples from the Bible before we go further into this. Because what we're going to see in this study, very briefly, is that these times of extra sacrifice, well, first of all, the times of regular sacrifices, and then the times of extra sacrifice, translated into times of prayer for the people of Israel, and even for the early believers. So one example is 1 Kings 18:36. This is when Elijah faced down the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. So 1 Kings 18:36, and it says, I'll just turn there quickly, that it was the time of the offering up the evening sacrifice, that Elijah the prophet came near and said, Adonai, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel. And when he did that, fire fell upon the sacrifice. So that very famous scene, it took place at the time of the evening, regular evening sacrifice. Daniel 8:11, which is a prophecy, talks about what we often refer to as like the Antichrist, or the one world ruler who will come along and he's going to try to become God. And, that's a whole other topic. But, many people say building the next temple or altar is a bad thing. The Bible doesn't actually say that. But what is bad is that this individual who comes along, it says in Daniel 8:11, will take away the daily offering. So it's not bad in biblical terms that they set it up. It's bad that this guy stops it and takes it away. Incidentally, tomorrow is the 17th of Tammuz, the month of Tammuz, and that is a memorial of the day that the walls of Jerusalem were breached during the siege by the Romans. And that day, which is tomorrow, is a day of fasting, actually, for Jewish people. And one reason it is, well, the walls of Jerusalem were breached, but also the sacrifice, the daily sacrifice, the regular offering was stopped on that day. And so that is similar to what Daniel 8:11 talks about will come in the future. Daniel 9:21. It's interesting. Let's look at that quickly. Daniel 9:21. There's a lot of interesting things in the book of Daniel, but he was fasting and praying, and it says that verse 20, while I was still speaking and praying, confessing my sin and the sin of my people, this is verse 20 of Daniel 9, my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before Adonai my God on behalf of the holy mountain of my God. Yes, while I was praying, Gabriel, the one I had seen in the earlier vision, the angel Gabriel, came to me swiftly about the time of the evening offering. So again, there were times of prayer at the time of the evening offering. It's a significant time to the Lord. The angel Gabriel came to Daniel at that time. These daily, as I alluded to earlier, daily regular times of sacrifice became connected to the daily prayers also. Psalm 141, verse 2. Psalm 141, verse 2. May my prayer rise before you like incense. May the lifting up of my hands be like the evening sacrifice. So there is a connection between the evening sacrifice and prayers going up to God very early on in the book of Psalms. Psalm 55, verse 17. I'm reading from the New King James Version here. This is King David. Evening, morning, and at noon I will pray and cry aloud, and he shall hear my voice. So even on early on, King David was, praying 3 times. Daniel 6:11. Here's Daniel again. Daniel did not cease to pray, facing Jerusalem. Would there ever come a time, let me ask you, that the government might tell us not to pray? Would they ever tell us not to sing? Let's think about that. Gee, I wonder, Well, Daniel was told not to pray to any other god except the idol, but he went home and he prayed as he did every day, 3 times a day towards Jerusalem. And it was in accordance, even though he was in exile in Babylon, with the times of the sacrifices in the temple. That's when people prayed. And that's the Jewish people pray even to this day. The Jewish synagogue prayers services have to do with the temple service. And so I just throw that out there because I say there could come a time very soon where we have to be like Daniel and say, I'm going to pray, I'm going to praise the Lord, and nobody can tell me not to. Because the Bible tells us, make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all ye people, shout unto the Lord. We're not told to be muzzled and be quiet. Now, I'm just saying, we're all trying to be respectful of others and take care of one another and all these things. But there does come a time where it could go too far, just as it was with Daniel. And he just kept praying. And he was thrown in the lion's den. This is going off track a bit, but God was with him. And you know the rest of the story. Amen. We'll talk about it another time. So the Jewish prayers daily are related to these regular times. Shacharit is the morning, Mincha is the afternoon, and Mariv is the evening. These became the daily prayers, even, as I said, going back to Daniel and King David and the Psalms and so on. And then in addition to these times of prayer in the synagogue, if it is a holy day like Shabbat, then there's the regular prayers, but there's an extra prayer added, extra prayers, where you're to focus on meditating and turning your heart towards the Lord. And it sort of, in a sense, took the place of the actual special extra Shabbat sacrifice or new moon sacrifice or Passover sacrifice. But it's an added prayer time. So that's where it is with modern Judaism. Now, just a few things I want to share about this, and then I'm going to close because tonight's a short teaching. I'm actually going to be trying to keep these teachings short going forward. But let me just share this because there's a lot of this, a lot to think about here. Number one, this is talking about the appointed times of the Lord, how God looks at the calendar and so on. It is important, number one, to understand the timings of the Lord. These timings of the Lord and appointed times are being restored to the body of Messiah. I am declaring that right now. We're seeing that happening. We are living it. We're here. This is part of it. We're part of it, but it is being restored. And all the original believers in Yeshua observed this calendar. And so, people are starting to realize, hey, I've even had, non-Jewish people come and say something's missing. And now they find out about the appointed times and the richness and the beauty, and it's biblical. And Yeshua did this, and so did Rabbi Shaul and Peter and all the early believers. So that's being restored. And we need to then understand and learn about this. And we don't just do it in an empty, vain way, but we know there's a fullness also that comes through understanding the messianic fullness and fulfillment. Number two, so it's important that we as a body of believers restore these things, understand these times, these appointed times. And I would even say, perhaps thinking of these times of prayer that even Daniel and King David talked about, which refer back to the daily offering, and then there would be the extra offering, the Musaf, the extra offering, which has been translated into modern Judaism, as I said, of the morning prayers, and then there'll be extra prayers. Now, so here's my second point. It's we, as individuals, have times of prayer. Nobody would argue that. Yeshua said, when you pray, don't pray like the hypocrites, etc., etc., but here's how you pray. And then he taught us. But he said, when you pray, because he's expecting believers will be people of prayer. Amen. And it is important that we have times of prayer. Now, we need to plan for that. Just like we look at this, God's calendar, we see that God has planned out. He's planned out the days, the weeks, the months, and the year, and even beyond, the 7-year cycle. And so, you see, it's not good for us to kind of just wake up and go, what am I going to do today? Now, sometimes that's okay, but you know what? It's better to be prepared and say, what's my plan for not just today, but the week, the month, the year, when's Passover coming? Be ready ahead of time. But I would just say this. Now, these times of offerings came to become the prayer times where certain prayers were prayed. The Shema was prayed. There was another prayer called the Amidah, which was added, especially at the holiday times. There was an extra Amidah prayer added. Amidah means standing prayer, because they would stand and recite it silently or in a whisper, because it's to be just focusing to God, your heart. And now these things, now I'm just saying this became part of the Jewish prayer life. Many of these prayers, as I've outlined here, go back to pre-Messianic Judaism, even to the time of Daniel and so on. It was probably established fully or starting around the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. But the early Messianic community did this. But I'm just saying, yes, it's true. Believers in Yeshua are not under an obligation to do all of these daily prayers at a certain time. But there is a universal principle here that it's good for us to have times of prayer, maybe even a couple of times a day. And there is, I think, a universal principle here that having it planned out and being prepared is a good thing, so that you can arrange your schedule to be able to say, here's when I'm praying and meeting with the Lord. And let me just say this too, daily. We should be praying daily. That's what this teaches us. But also, there's extra times, like weekly Shabbat times, where we should be coming together. It's so important to come together and pray together. And then Pesach. So those are extra times. So you don't like say, well, I'm not doing my daily prayer today because it's Shabbat. No, it's like extra, more prayer and more worship. And so that's, I think, the main thing I wanted to share today. Important to understand the timings of the Lord and understand how Numbers 28 and 29 connected to the daily sacrifices and then the additional sacrifices, and how that translated through Jewish history in the biblical time period into the prayer service. And then the Messianic Jewish movement came not from out of nowhere, from that context. And so in that, I think there's something for us to think about. Yeshua prayed these prayers. Not all the prayers that are today in the synagogue, but many of them, the Shema, for example, and the morning, afternoon, and evening prayers. And so there is beauty in them. We don't want to become just reciting things and doing things thinking that it's going to earn us more merit or salvation. That's not the point. But yes, we are to cultivate a life of prayer. Friends, thank you for joining today. I'm going to close right now. God bless you. And please join us this Shabbat for a Shabbat service at 10:30. And I invite you to please like and share this video. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can be aware when you'll get notifications when we're going to be doing other videos. So shalom. God bless you all. Nice to see you. And we'll see you soon. Bye for now.